So I want to tell you what today is about because this lecture, has the unusual structure that I like to do where we tell a story, and I want to tell you what we're going to do before we get started with that. So you are here to learn chi-square. That is the statistical test we're covering today, and by the time you're done with these videos, you will be able to run it by hand, interpret the result, report it in APA format, and explain what it means. That's the technical destination. But I want to back up and tell you what chi-square actually does. And it is chi, not chai or chi or anything like that. It's chi. So let me tell you what it does without running any numbers or doing any math, because understanding that will make everything that follows make sense. So here is the core problem that chi-square solves. You are a researcher. You look at the world and you notice a pattern. Some group has higher rates of something than another group. Some outcome is more common in one community than another. Something is distributed unevenly across different categories in ways that you think might be meaningful. And you have a question about this. Is this pattern you're seeing, are these differences you're seeing real, or is it just noise? Is it just random variation that, that always shows up in any data set, whether or not anything interesting is actually happening? So that question matters enormously, because if the pattern is real, it demands an explanation. It means something is producing this pattern. It means there's a variable, a cause that you need to find and understand. But if the pattern is just noise, then you're chasing a ghost, right? You're building theories and policies and arguments on top of random variation, which is one of the most dangerous things a researcher can do. And it is something that people have done a lot of in the past, particularly before they had statistical tools to determine these things. And we're going to talk about one of those times when it was done in a very kind of negative, nasty, racist way. So chi-square is the tool that answers this question. It does not tell you why a pattern exists. It doesn't tell you what caused it. It tells you just one single thing. Is this pattern so obvious, so true, so large that it couldn't have occurred by chance? Is it too large to have occurred by chance? Is what I observe so different from what I would expect if nothing were happening that I can no longer say that it's just random variation? So that's it. That's the entire purpose of this test. Is the pattern real, or is it noise? Is it, what I would expect in just a normal situation, or is there actually something changing things, and that's what's causing this difference? So now here's why I'm spending the first part of this lecture telling you a story before I show you a single formula. So chi-square needs two things to work. It needs data, observed frequencies, counts of how many people or things fell into each category, and it needs an expectation, a baseline prediction of what the counts should look like if the pattern weren't real. Okay, if there was nothing going on, if there's nothing interesting happening, if there's no variable changing things, okay, what would we expect to see if the null hypothesis were true, right? So the test measures the gap between what you observed and what you expected, and evaluates whether that gap is large enough to take seriously. So if you expect nothing to happen and yet you're seeing something happen and it's really significant, now you know that there is something to take serious. So the story that I'm about to tell you, this history that we're about to follow, provides both of those things. It gives you a pattern, one of the most striking and well-documented patterns in American history, and it gives you an expectation to test it against it. It also gives you something most statistics lectures do not, a reason, hopefully, to care whether the pattern is real. That's why I try to tell these stories, because this particular pattern has been used to argue that some groups of people are inferior to others, permanently, biologically, genetically, that there's nothing you can do to change it. And chi-squared, applied correctly to the actual real data, is the tool that definitively answers that argument. So the history is not, background. It's not a warm-up exercise. It's not context, provided to make statistics feel friendlier. The history is the variable that we're going to be testing. So the historical process I'm about to describe is the explanation for the pattern we're going to test. You can't choose the right null hypothesis without understanding it. You can't interpret the result without understanding it. And you can't appreciate why the result matters, why it's worth knowing whether the pattern is real, without understanding it. So 2,000 years ago, the Roman Empire invaded Britain. They conquered the south and the east of the island. They built cities, they installed written law, established courts, and over almost 4 centuries, they replaced the indigenous culture, the indigenous Celtic culture, with Roman institutional culture. So the people whose ancestors went through that transformation eventually became the English. In the north and west of Britain, the Scottish, the Irish, the Welsh, the borderlands, they resisted Roman conquest and managed to stay unconquered. So their Celtic culture survived intact. So same island, same Celtic ancestors at the starting point, one group colonized by Rome, one group not. That's where this story begins. And then 1,500 years later, both groups cross the Atlantic and they build two different versions of America, two different Americas. The colonized Celtic descendants, the English, they became the North, and the uncolonized Celts, the Scottish and the Irish, they became the Southerners. And we see some very interesting gaps between the two cultures. And those gaps eventually led to the Civil War, right? And they're still causing issues today. But the story doesn't end there. We also see effects on enslaved and not enslaved Black Americans. Enslaved Black Americans spent 2.5 centuries in very close proximity to the Scotch-Irish Southern culture, absorbing that ancient Celtic culture into their own African cultural, when their own African cultural roots were severed. And that transmission is measurable too, and it connects directly to the racial disparities that get debated today. Unemployment, incarceration, educational attainment, in ways that most of the debate completely misses, because most of that debate assumes the only variable is race, when the actual variable is institutional inheritance going back 2,000 years. So I hope this is an interesting case for you that maybe makes things more interesting than simply doing mathematical formulas. So we're going to get into it. And I'll also do a little bit of, I know most of my students are not white or Black, so I'm also going to throw in a little bit of interesting information about how this same culture is affecting Hispanic inheritance along the way. So let's get started. It starts about 2,500 years ago around the Mediterranean Sea, and it ends with the formula that you're going to calculate by hand today. And somewhere in the middle, a Roman emperor builds a wall across the north of England that still stands there today, and that wall has something to do with why America looks the way it looks. Okay, so interesting start, I hope, but I want to start somewhere closer to home. So I want to ask you something. What language are you speaking right now? Probably if you talked back to me, you'd speak English, right? You understand me. And what language did you speak this morning before you came here? Probably chances are Spanish or Spanish mixed with English or some version of it, both, because that's what most of my students speak. And where did Spanish come from? Spanish comes from Latin. Latin is the language of Rome, and the Roman Empire at its height, around 100 AD, controlled most of Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. And the people they conquered learned Latin. Not always willingly, but they learned it. And over centuries, Latin evolved into the languages that we now call the Romance languages: Spanish, Portuguese, French, Italian, Romanian. Every one of those languages is Latin that's been living in a different climate for 1,500 years. So when you speak Spanish, you're speaking a version of Roman. When you say ley, that means law, that's Latin lex. When you say justice, that is Latin justitia. When you say escuela, school, that's Latin scola. When you say gracias, Latin is gratias. It's the same language, okay? So the vocabulary of civic life in Spanish, law, justice, school, city, contract, court, government, all of that, it's almost an entirely Roman vocabulary. And if you have been speaking Spanish your whole life, you've actually been speaking Roman without knowing it. Okay? Now, there's a point to this. Let me show you something interesting. If you grew up in Mexico, or your parents did, or your grandparents, think about the center of whatever town they came from. Not the suburbs, not the highway strip, the old center. What does it look like? There's almost certainly like a large open plaza, the Zócalo, or the Plaza Principal. On one side of the plaza, there's probably a cathedral, like on the other side, a government building, like the Palacio Municipal. Maybe a market, maybe a fountain in the middle, and please don't criticize my accent. I'm doing the best I can, but the point is that layout is not Spanish. Well, it is Spanish, but the Spanish got it from Rome. Every Roman town was built around a central open space called the Forum, flanked by public buildings, a basilica for course and commerce, a temple, government offices. The Spanish colonizers who built Mexican cities in the 1500s and 1600s were required by law, a law called the Law of the Indies, issued by the Spanish crown in 1573, was required to lay out every new colonial city on a Roman grid with a central plaza surrounded by civic and religious institutions. So, when your grandmother walked to Mass in the morning and passed the municipal building on the way, she was walking a path that Roman urban planners designed 2,000 years before she was born. And the church itself is a Roman institution in its bones. And that's just a historical observation. The Catholic Church's organizational structure: Pope, Cardinal, Archbishop, Bishop, Priest, Parish. It's the Roman provincial administrative structure preserved in church form. And after the Roman Empire fell, in the western half of the Roman Empire fell in 476, the church stepped in to that vacuum in order to organize the world. It kept Latin as its official language because it was Roman. That's why we call it the Roman Catholic Church. It kept Roman administrative boundaries as its diocese. The word diocese in Latin means administrative district. The word pontiff, the Pope's title, comes from Pontifex Maximus, which is a Roman priest office that existed centuries before Christianity. Okay, so the institution that baptized your parents, married your grandparents, buried your great-grandparents, shaped the moral framework for your family for generations, that institution is Roman in its structure. Okay, so it's very interesting, the Roman legal system, the Roman logic, all of this is part of your culture. Okay. And I'm not saying that to diminish your faith or your culture. I'm saying the opposite. The civilization we're going to talk about today, and we're going to run statistics on today, the civilization that built who we are as people, all of us today, really to some degree, isn't foreign to you. You already are part of it. You brought it with you. It's in your language, your church, your city, your legal vocabulary, your family structure. Okay, so the story that I'm about to tell isn't just the story of Europe. It's the story of many other cultures that sort of descended from Roman influence, okay? But to understand why it matters for statistics, we need to go back to where it started, okay? So Western civilization, the civilization that produced universities, hospitals, courts of law, representative government, the scientific method, and eventually the statistics course you're sitting in right now is built from three sources. So think of three rivers that merged over about 1,000 years into one large river. So each river contributed something different. Each one is essential. And you can't understand what Rome built or why it mattered without understanding where Rome itself got its ideas. So the first river flows from ancient Greece, roughly 500 to 300 BC, before Christ. So this was an extraordinary period in human history. In a very relatively small geographic area, the city-states of Greece, especially Athens, a group of thinkers began asking questions that no one had formally asked before. You remember we talked about Socrates. This is his place of origin. So the most important question they asked was, how do you know if something's true? And that, of course, sounds simple, but it's not, right? Before the Greeks systematized it, the primary answer to how do you know if something is true was because the chief said so, or because the priest said so, or because our ancestors always believed it. So authority and tradition were the sources of truth. This is not a small thing, right? Authority and tradition are genuinely important sources of knowledge, and we shouldn't dismiss them. But they have a limitation. They can't resolve disputes. If the chief says one thing and your neighbor says another, you have no method for deciding between them other than whose authority is greater. And then, if that's the case, you're stuck. So the person with more power wins the argument, regardless of who's right. The Greeks, particularly Socrates and his student Plato and his student Aristotle, they proposed a different answer. You know if something is true by examining the evidence and reasoning carefully about it. This is not the attitude that people had before the Greeks, in general at least. Truth is not determined by who's speaking, the Greeks said. It's determined by the quality of the argument and the accuracy of the observations. So this is the foundation of logic, of philosophy, of science, and of statistics. When you run a chi-square test today, you are doing something that would be recognizable to Aristotle. You're asking, is this pattern I observe in this data real, or could it have happened by chance? And you're answering that question not by consulting an authority, but by following a procedure, a method that anyone can apply, and that will give the same answer regardless of who uses it. So the Greeks also established democracy, right, in Athens. The idea that political authority derives from the people, not from a divine, a god or hereditary power. They established philosophy, the sort of systematic love of wisdom, the idea that the best life is one that's examined and understood. They established the foundations of mathematics and geometry. Euclid's Elements was written around 300 BC, and it established a model of rigorous proof, starting from axioms, from rules, and deriving conclusions through logical steps. So, and the mathematicians still use this today, and it underlies every statistical test that you're learning in this course. So the Greek idea that reason is a path to truth, and that truth is accessible to anyone willing to think carefully, is the deepest root of scientific tradition and therefore of statistics. So we have the Greeks to thank for that. So that's the first river. The second river flows from the Hebrew tradition, from Israel, from the text and the moral frameworks of ancient Israel, and then from the Christian tradition that grew out of it. So the central moral claim of this tradition is one of the most radical ideas in human history. And I want you to hear it as the revolutionary claim that it was. Every single human being has inherent worth and dignity. Not just the powerful, not just the wealthy, not just the members of your tribe or your nation. Every person, the slave, the widow, the foreigner, the prisoner, the child, every one of them is, in the language of the book of Genesis in the Bible, made in the image of God, and therefore worth something. In the ancient world, this was not obvious, and it certainly was not the default assumption. Most ancient civilizations organized themselves around the idea that some people mattered more than others. The king's life was worth more than the slave's life, that your own tribe's suffering mattered, and a stranger's tribe's suffering did not matter. Slaves were property, not people. The Hebrew tradition challenged this at its root. There's a higher law. The Hebrew prophets insisted that this higher law stands above any king or emperor, and that law demands justice for the powerless. So this moral tradition flowed into Christianity, and then through Christianity into the foundation of Western law and politics. So the idea that individuals have rights that can't simply be taken from them, that is what we would call Judeo-Christian ethics, translated into legal practice. The abolition of slavery, the recognition of universal human rights, protections built into modern research ethics that require you to treat your study participants well, to obtain their informed consent. These are Judeo-Christian moral intuitions encoded into institutional practice. So for your purpose in this course, when your textbook includes examples that focuses on like social inequality, when the author reminds you that statistics is a tool that should be used to, illuminate human suffering and promote justice, they're working in this Judeo-Christian tradition. So statistics is not morally neutral, right? We've talked about this. What you choose to measure and whose experiences you choose to make visible in data is a moral choice. So the tradition that insists that everyone's experience matters is the tradition that makes making a moral choice unavoidable. You have to make a moral choice. You have to think about this because you have been influenced by Judeo-Christian values. So one more thing about this tradition that's directly relevant to your background. The New Testament, the foundational text of Christianity, was written in Greek. The theological tradition that produced Catholic doctrine was developed by Greek-speaking scholars in the Eastern Mediterranean and then, transmitted westward through Latin translation. So when you receive communion, you're participating in a ritual whose theological meaning was, worked out in Greek philosophical vocabulary by scholars who were themselves working in the Greek philosophical tradition. So the church is, among other things, kind of Greek philosophy in liturgical form. The third river is Rome, and Rome is where the first two rivers come together and get institutionalized, turned from ideas into functioning social structures that affect daily life for ordinary people and have affected it for thousands of years. So Rome's contribution, it's easy to misunderstand. Rome was not primarily a civilization of great original ideas. The Greeks were. The Romans read Greek philosophy. They were strongly influenced by it, and they produced some impressive philosophers of their own, Cicero, Marcus Aurelius, Seneca. But Rome's genius wasn't that they were philosophers or even great thinkers in that sense. Rome's genius was organizational. Rome's contribution to civilization was figuring out how to make large, complex societies of very diverse people work together in an orderly way, kind of like modern America does. And yes, they also had their issues with it, but they did it better than anybody else, just like we do. So how do you make that happen? Rome's answer was written law, applied consistently to everyone within their jurisdiction, not to the chief's personal judgment, not family connections, not what your particular tribe has always done. Written law, recorded, public, accessible, predictable. It applies to every Roman citizen from Spain to Syria. And this sounds obvious to us now because we live inside it still. We're still within the Roman legal system, even though you don't realize it. But it wasn't obvious back then. It was a genuine civilizational achievement. The Roman legal system developed over roughly 500 years from the original laws where there are 12 tables. You might remember this from history class in, 450 BC to the Corpus Juris Civilis compiled under Emperor Justinian in 533 AD. And it created the framework for what we now call the rule of law, okay, our legal system. The idea that disputes are resolved by rules rather than by power or violence. So the idea that, contracts are enforceable by a third party, a court, rather than depending solely on the honor of the parties involved. The idea that property rights last across time and can be inherited or transferred in orderly ways. These ideas, which were continued through Christianity, through the Catholic Church and so on after Rome fell, through medieval universities, through the Renaissance recovery of the Roman legal text, through the Spanish legal system, through Spanish colonial administration of Mexico. These ideas are the foundation of the legal and civic world that you and I grew up in. For instance, the Mexican Constitution, the system of notaries and public registration of documents and the structure of the municipal government and, the American concept of legal personhood and individual rights. All of this is Rome. In forms that have been adapted and transformed over 2,000 years, but it's still Roman. Now, here's the crucial thing that links all three of these rivers together and explains why they matter for a statistics lecture. So Greek reason says truth can be found through systematic inquiry. And the method matters. Not the authority, not the power, not violence. The method of thinking about things matters. Judeo-Christian ethics says every person's experience matters, and justice demands that we pay attention to the powerless as well as the powerful. And Roman civic order says the way you build a society where reason can function and justice can operate through written institutions, written law, written records, written contracts, that applies consistently and outlasts any individual. It's eternal, okay? Unlike an individual person. So statistics is what happens when all three of these traditions are applied to a question about human behavior or whatever. It's a systematic inquiry. There's a process of inquiring, a process of asking. That's, in service of justice. It uses written institutional methods. So we're going to look at census data to ask, with literacy, whether there's a regional origin associated with literacy, whether literacy is different depending on the region of the country that you're in. And this is something that requires all three of these rivers, all three of these tributaries. You need Greek reason to construct the question in a rigorous way. You need Judeo-Christian ethics to insist that the answer matters at all, that the suffering of the illiterate matter, that slaves who can't read are still important. And you need Roman civic order because, without the census records that they kept back in the 1800s, then you wouldn't have the records of people's institutional lives or individual lives, and there'd be no data to analyze at all. Okay, you need all three of those. So now let's look a little bit about what we're getting into, the history of what Rome actually built, because this is where the story gets more concrete and kind of strange and directly relevant to American history despite being 2,000 years apart. So in 43 AD, the Emperor Claudius ordered the invasion of England, or what they called Britain back then. Julius Caesar he'd invaded and raided England twice in 55 and 54 BC, but he hadn't stayed. It had been too much for him. So Claudius wanted it to be a permanent province of Rome. And the legions crossed the Channel, and they defeated the main British resistance, the Celts, within a few weeks. And they began the process of building a Roman civilization in the island's southern and eastern lowlands. So what did that look like in practice? Well, one example archaeologically is the Bloomberg tablets. So in 2010, construction workers excavating the foundations for a building in London, which sits directly on the top of the ancient Roman city that they called Londinium, they dug into a drainage ditch that had been buried for nearly 2,000 years, and in the mud of that ditch, they found over 400 wooden writing tablets that were remarkably preserved, and they dated from approximately 50 AD to 300 AD. So these were thin pieces of wood, roughly the size of an index card, and they had like a shallow recess that was filled with black beeswax, and you write in the wax with a metal stylus because paper was expensive back then. So the wax tablet is your document, your contract, your record, your letter, and when you're done with it, you can just smooth the wax over and you can reuse it. But over 2,000 years of being buried in this mud, the wax absorbed the tannin from the wood and left like an impression of the last writing, like an ancient photocopy. So what they found on these tablets was, for instance, a promissory note dated January 8th, 57 AD, which was only 14 years after the Romans invaded. So only 14 years, a businessman in Londinium was lending money to another businessman under written contract law, creating legally enforceable records of debt with the date, the amount, the names of the parties, the terms of the repayment. Less than a generation, only 14 years after the Roman legions arrived, people in London were doing written commercial transactions under Roman legal procedure. The Romans were great at what they did, which was organization. So they found court records, formal legal proceedings between like litigants conducted according to Roman procedure with written documentation. So a city that barely existed 30 years earlier was already running a court system, which was amazing. They found shipping records, employment contracts, debt acknowledgments, all this documentation of a well-functioning commercial society. Okay, so now keep that image in your head, okay? 14 years after the Romans have invaded, massive warfare, killing people, colonialization on a massive scale, right? And on a much more violent scale than what happened here in America. And America was bad enough, right? And within 14 years, they had a functioning legal system. Things were organized, written down, signed, legally enforceable, court systems in place. Okay, now let me show you what existed north of this, north of a wall that would be built 65 years later. So if you've traveled up north in England, this is the area that you'd get to. And in 122 AD, the Emperor Hadrian traveled personally to Britain, one of the very few emperors to do so, and he ordered the construction of a wall across the entire width of England. And the wall ran 73 miles, the narrowest point of England, from the east coast to the west coast of what's now northern England. So it was built primarily of stone. It stood roughly 4 to 5 meters high, which is 12 to 15 feet tall, about the height of a 2-story building. And it had a big ditch on the northern side with spikes, wooden spikes, and behind it, an earthwork, like a hill called the Wallum, that kept people from coming in. It controlled civilian movement on the Roman side. Along its length were 80 little forts called mile castles, which was one fort every Roman castle, where soldiers could open and close a gate to control passage. And between the mile castles were observation towers. Every 5 miles, there was a full-size garrison fort holding 500 to 1,000 soldiers. And at peak operation, there was between 9,000 and 15,000 soldiers stationed along this wall and supporting its infrastructure. It's the most heavily fortified frontier in the Roman world. And you can still walk along it today. It's still there. A lot of it's still standing nearly 2,000 years later. So I want you to think about what it meant to build something like this. Why did the Romans build such a huge, well-enforced wall and put so much money into guarding it? They didn't build Hadrian's Wall because the people on the other side were just a little different from them. They built it because every attempt to extend Roman civilization into the far north of Britain, basically into Scotland, had failed. The terrain was too rugged, the population was too resistant, they were too violent, they were just too stubborn to become Romanized. And the culture on the other side was so fundamentally different from Roman civic order that it couldn't be incorporated into the Roman system. Okay. We often think of the Romans as like these sex-obsessed, crazy, wild people. That's how Hollywood likes to portray them. But that was a very small part of very elite Roman society. That was like the Epstein Island people of Rome. The rest of Roman society was ordered. They were values-based. They had strong morals. And order was what Rome was all about. The culture on the other side, though, was very different. So here's the thing that most history courses get wrong, or at least leave out. And it's the most important single fact for understanding everything that follows. Before Rome arrived in Britain, the people south of where Hadrian's Wall would be built and the people north of it were not different people. They were the same people. They spoke this related, at least Celtic languages. They organized themselves around the same principles. Clan loyalty, oral law, cattle economy, honor culture, personal reputation as the foundation of social order. There's a book about the Great Irish Cattle Raid Epic, and it could have been set anywhere in pre-Roman Britain. The English Britons were the same as the Scottish Britons. It was the same Celtic people. Okay, so one people, one culture, but two destinies determined entirely by whether Rome got to them. So the people of lowland Britain, what we now call England's south and eastern areas, were conquered by Rome in 43 AD. Right? And over the following 3.5 centuries, Roman occupation systematically replaced Celtic culture with Roman institutional culture. It was not gentle. Roman colonization was coercive, it was often violent, it was culturally destructive to the people that it happened to. One author said that Romans create a desert and call it peace. So they destroy everything and then say, we brought peace. Okay. Celtic oral law was replaced with written Roman law. Celtic clan structures were reorganized into Roman administrative units. Celtic religious practices were suppressed and eventually replaced, first with Roman paganism and then Roman Christianity. The Celtic language of lowland Britain, Brittonic, was replaced by Latin, which over centuries evolved into what we now call English, in addition to not just the Romans colonizing, but the Germans colonizing and the Anglos and the Saxons and the French, and everybody wanted to colonize England. It's funny, we think of England as the colonizers, but they were probably more colonized than any other country. So the people of Highland Britain, on the other hand, the northern and the western areas of the British island, Scotland, Ireland, Wales, the borderlands, they were never conquered by the Romans. Not for lack of Roman trying. The Romans mounted multiple campaigns into Scotland. They tried. Gnaeus Julius Agricola campaigned all the way to the far north in the 70s and 80s AD, and he won a lot of battles, but the terrain was too rugged, and especially the population was too resistant, and the economic value of more conquest wasn't enough to justify the cost. So the Romans pulled back and they just built a wall, and they're like, we're just leaving you alone. You Scottish people stay up there, and us Romans will stay down here with the English and do our thing down here. Okay, because we're done. We're done trying. The English were hard enough to conquer. We're not going to bother with you guys. Which means that the Highland Celts kept their culture intact, while their lowland cousins, the English, were being transformed by 3.5 centuries of Roman occupation. The Scottish continued to live by, and the Scottish, the Irish, the Welsh, they continued to live by ideas of like the clan, the honor price, the cattle raid, oral law, exactly as they always had for centuries. Not because they were backwards or because they were inferior, but because their land was a little bit more rugged, they had been able to resist conquest by the Romans. And by then, of course, the Romans were also going broke. There's a lot of other issues back in Rome, so Rome just finally gave up, and they weren't conquered. And nobody came to replace their culture with something else. They kept their original culture, okay? So let that sit for a moment, because it's the key to everything that we're going to do here, okay? When we talk today, what we're going to talk about today is the difference between two cultures in America, okay? With kind of a third culture tossed into it, but I'll explain that. The North and the South, that's what we're talking about, and the differences between today. Okay? The North is Puritan New England culture, and the South is Scots-Irish backcountry culture. Okay? And when we talk about those, we're not talking about a difference between English people and Scottish people, even though that is what we're getting into. So the English from the south of England migrated to the north of America, and the Scotch-Irish migrated to the south and created the north and the southern cultures. But when we're talking about those, we're not talking about English people and Scottish people, okay? Or civilized people and uncivilized people, or white people who behave a certain way and other white people who behave a different way. We're talking about the difference between two Celtic groups, okay? Two groups of Celtic descendants. The same Celts who took two different paths. One group of Celtic descendants whose culture was replaced by Roman institution almost 2 millennia ago, and another group of Celtic descendants whose culture was never replaced. The English did not invent literacy. They didn't invent compulsory public schools. They didn't invent written law. Rome gave them all those things by force over centuries of occupation. The Scotch-Irish never got that intervention. They arrived in America carrying a pre-Roman Celtic culture that was already ancient even before Julius Caesar was born, okay? So this is a really interesting sort of setup. Remember in the other lecture we talked about, like East Germany and West Germany. We have another natural experiment here that we can do statistics on that, even more interesting, applies directly to our country and modern issues of racism and so on that we're dealing with today. Okay, so again, here's where it becomes extremely useful for a psychology and statistics course, because what Hadrian's Wall created entirely by accident and then maintained by the Romans for nearly 4 centuries is something that, researchers dream about and almost never get, except for like in East and West Germany, where another wall was built, right? It's a natural experiment. So in a controlled laboratory experiment, you take one group of subjects and you expose them to a treatment. You take another group, identical in every relevant way, and don't expose them to the treatment. So you've got your control group. And after a sufficient time, you measure both groups on the outcome variable. If there's any difference you observe, can be attributed to the treatment, because that's the only difference between the two groups, was whether or not they received it. So the problem with studying human cultures is that you almost never have that kind of control, right? Different groups differ in geography, genetics, economics, climate, religion, historical timing, and dozens of other variables all at the same time. So when you find a difference in outcomes between two groups, it's hard to know which variable is doing the explanatory work, because too many variables have changed at once. So Hadrian's Wall gave historians, and by extension psychologists and statisticians, something remarkably close to the controlled experiment that they can never otherwise run, right? Just like East Germany and West Germany did. So take one population, you've got the Celtic peoples of Britain, genetically similar, related languages, culturally nearly identical at their baseline, same island, similar ecology across most of it, same general climate. Now apply a treatment to them, okay? 3.5 centuries of Roman colonial occupation. That's the treatment. Replacing oral law with written law, clan structures with Roman administration, cattle economy with market economy, honor culture with contract culture, and then don't apply this treatment to the others. Keep them as the control group, let them continue to live as they always have, wait 1,500 years, and then measure. So the differences you observe between the cultural descendants of the treated group and the untreated group, it can't be explained just by genetics, right? They're the same genetic people at baseline. They can't be explained by climate or geography because they generally share similar environment. And as we'll see, the same differences appear when these groups relocate to America and then they face identical geography. So it cannot easily be explained by, inherent or inborn genetic superiority or inferiority of either group. The untreated group, the untreated group would be the ones that didn't have Roman institutions, was not conquered. When it's later exposed to Roman institutions by the treated group, the descendants of the colonized Celts, they start to become more similar. They actually show improvement in some ways, civilizationally speaking, and become more similar, okay? So it's not that one group is different than the other, it's just simply what they've been exposed to. So what's left after you strip away all those alternative variables is culture, specifically, institutional habits, behavioral dispositions, attitudes towards written record keeping, attitudes towards formal education, towards, production systems, contracts, and so on, that the Romans gave to one group and didn't give to the other group because they never conquered them. So this does not mean, I know we talked about this in the Germany video, but this doesn't mean that a natural experiment is perfect. Natural experiments never are. There were some geographical differences between like the lowlands and the highlands. The historical timing isn't identical. The Scots-Irish had some exposure to Roman influence through trade and Christianity later on, even without direct conquest. So the treatment wasn't uniform, right? Different parts of Roman Britain were more heavily Romanized than others. But by the standards of cross-cultural historical comparison, this is extraordinarily clean, okay? It is a good experiment. So we're not comparing like Western Europe to East Asians, okay? Or industrial nations to agricultural ones, or Christian cultures to non-Christian ones. Those are huge variables. We're going to be comparing the descendants of one Celtic population that was colonized to the descendants of the same Celtic population that was not. So this is as close to a controlled human experiment as history ever produces. And chi-square is the statistical tool that we're going to use for determining whether the results of that experiment are statistically real, whether the differences we observe depart so far from what independence would predict, what the control would be, that we can no longer attribute them to chance. Now, like I said, the southern Celts that were colonized by the Romans, and we now call the English, and the northern Celts that were not colonized by the Romans, whom we now call the Irish and the Scottish, or combined the Scotch-Irish, they migrated over to America. The Scotch-Irish went to the south, and the English went to the north. Okay, so now in America we have these two Celtic groups, okay, that were either Romanized. So the Northerners in America are Romanized Celts, and the Southerners are unromanized Celts. The Northerners were colonized Celts, the Southerners were uncolonized Celts. Okay, so before we follow those ships across the Atlantic, let's talk about what these cultures were like. Okay, when they migrate. So when we talk about the English, we're generally talking about the Puritans and to some degree the Quakers, but we won't get into it too much, coming over to the north. Okay, the New Englanders were the Puritans. So the Puritan tradition was literacy, schools, being productive, working hard, trusting institutions. And these aspects of Puritan tradition, these advantages of this culture, are the advantages of colonized people. Okay, so the English Celts, who became the Puritans, they didn't choose Roman institutions. Okay, Rome forced them on them. And again, the process was coercive, it was violent, it was culturally destructive. The Celtic language, the Celtic oral law, the Celtic religious practices, the Celtic clan structure, all of it was destroyed. It was either replaced or was transformed beyond recognition. So the descendants of these English Celts, by the time they came over to America, they had no memory of ever having been a Celt. They thought of themselves as English, and their original culture was gone. It had been smashed into the ground. Okay. The Scotch-Irish, by contrast, were cultural survivors. So they successfully resisted conquest. They preserved their pre-Roman way of life, the honor culture, the clan loyalty, suspicion of institutions, particularly written institutions, violence, warfare. They were warrior tribes. All of that survived. And it didn't just survive in Scotland and Ireland, but it survived crossing the Atlantic and was brought over to America with them. Okay? So the cultural patterns, and this is kind of ironic, the cultural patterns of the English Celts that produced really good results in American history were actually themselves the product of conquest and colonization. The English were colonized by the Romans. Okay? So it's just a sort of interesting point to make. And that doesn't make these institutions less valuable. Okay? It doesn't mean that Roman colonization was good. It means the relationship between conquest and cultural outcome is complicated, okay, in ways that sort of resist moral framing. It's hard to say what's good and what's bad with something like colonization. Colonization can install institutions that the colonized eventually come to sort of own it and transmit it as their own. They say this was forced upon us, but you know what, we're going to roll with it. There was at least a silver lining in all of this violence and destruction. And that's what happened in lowland Britain, in England. That's what eventually happened in like Mexico, where Roman civic order arrived via Spain and produce things that Mexican culture values today, or other South American cultures and Central American cultures that were basically descendants of the Roman Empire. So anyhow, what makes the comparison between the English descendants, or what we'll just start calling the Puritan descendants, and the Scotch-Irish descendants so statistically valuable is that the baseline between them was the same. Okay, the treatment's defined, and the duration was certainly long enough that the results are measurable. So it's not a comparison between different peoples, it's a comparison between the same people treated differently by the same empire. Okay? And so that's the natural experiment that Hadrian's Wall created. So let's talk about the Puritans first, the English colonized Celts. Okay, the Celts that were colonized by the Romans, who became the English, and then specifically the Puritan English who migrated over. So between roughly 1629 and 1640, approximately 20,000 people crossed the Atlantic from England to what we call New England. That's why we call it that. So I want you to notice where they came from, because that matters. Okay, they came from East Anglia, which is a bulge of England that kind of sticks out into the North Sea, and it was among the most thoroughly Romanized region of Britain. Okay, this was the epitome of a Romanized English person. Roman towns, Roman roads, Roman administrative infrastructure, Roman organized dense settlements instead of like farms and clans and so on. Intensive agriculture. When the Romans arrived in 43 AD, they liked this land, and so they transformed it first and most completely. So the people whose descendants became the Puritans had been living inside Roman culture and Roman institutions, and what descended from it, the people that descended from this, lived in Roman culture for basically 15 centuries before they boarded ships for Massachusetts. Okay, so these people were the Puritans, and if you don't know who they were, a Protestant sect who believed the Reformation hadn't gone far enough, that the Puritans, or the Protestants who left Catholicism, hadn't gone far enough, they hadn't been extreme enough. They wanted to build, in their words, a city upon a hill, a Christian city, a godly city. And they had a very specific idea of what a godly society required. It required universal literacy. Everybody needs to be able to read and read well. Every soul must be able to read the Bible personally, not hear it read by a priest, read it yourself. And that, which was a Roman idea too, we all need to read. You need to be able to read things for yourself. So that theological conviction had enormous practical consequences. If every soul must read, every child must be taught. And if every child must be taught, you need schools. And if you need schools, you need to fund them. So watch how fast this happens. 1630, the Puritans arrive, okay, in Massachusetts Bay. By 1636, they founded Harvard College. Harvard. Okay, 6 years after arrival, they showed up in a new world on empty land with Indians trying to kill them and fighting with each other and whatever, and starving. No infrastructure whatsoever, no roads. And within 6 years, they built Harvard. Not they built a little village to live in and some shelters. They built Harvard. By 1642, another 6 years later, they passed the first compulsory education law in the New World. Okay, only 12 years after arrival, everybody has to go to school. Every child needs to go to school. Another 5 years passed, 1647, they passed what they called the Old Deluder Satan Act, okay, which was this idea that the old deluder, or the old liar, the old trickster, which is the devil, they had this philosophy that the devil is trying to trick people into not believing in God, not being Christians, and the only way to combat that is by getting people to read the Bible. So this law required that if you lived in a town of 50 or more households, you had to hire and pay for a school teacher for the town. And that was only 17 years after they arrived in the New World. So the first law in the history of the English-speaking world requiring public-funded schools. Okay? That's how much these people valued reading and education. So think about that sequence. 1630 to 1636, 1642, 1647, arrive, university, compulsory publicly funded schools, 17 years. Okay? Now, I want you to understand what that speed represents. Okay? The Puritans did not invent the idea of compulsory literacy out of thin air. They were drawing on an institutional inheritance that stretched back through the medieval church, whose organizational structure was Roman, back through the Roman imperial administration of Britain, which required literacy for its bureaucracy, all the way back to, the Bloomberg Tablet, all the way back to the ancient Roman Empire, okay, who also strongly valued literacy. Okay, so Harvard in 1636, the Bloomberg Tablets in 57 AD, the same institutional impulse, the same drive, write it down, make it enforceable, create records that outlast the individuals involved, operating 1600 years later on the other side of the Atlantic in a community whose Celtic ancestors were colonized by Rome and whose culture was transformed by that colonization into something capable of building a university like Harvard in 6 years. That's amazing, okay? So the colonized Celts built Harvard. That's something I want you to think about, okay? The colonized Celts, the people who experienced all this hardship, colonization, and so on, because of Roman culture, they built Harvard. That's pretty phenomenal. So we also see this, like, for instance, in Mexico. So you've got, like, the Royal and Pontifical University of Mexico, founded in 1551, around kind of the same time period, by the royal decree of Charles I of Spain. So 30 years after the conquest of Tenochtitlan, 85 years before Harvard. It's one of the oldest universities in the Western Hemisphere, operating in the New World before England had even established a single settlement on the North American continent. So why does that matter here? Because it's the same story. It's a different branch, same transmission chain. I just want to show you that because VBC is a Hispanic serving institution, most of our students are Hispanic, that even though I'm talking about white people and later on black people to some degree, this is also the history of Hispanic people. This is the same story, just a different branch. But the Spanish were also colonized by Rome. And so if you're Mexican, if you're Ecuadorian, if you're Colombian, whatever, if you're Cuban, Puerto Rican, you are also a descendant of Roman colonization. You are, in some sense, Roman. Okay, so the Spanish colonial administration that built that university was operating under the same Roman civic inheritance that produced the Puritan impulse to be educated, okay, but just transmitted through a different pathway. So Rome, through the Catholic Church, through the medieval universities in Spain of like Salamanca and Bologna, through the Spanish legal system, through the laws of the Indies that required every colonial city to be built on that Roman city grid. It's the same institutional logic that drove the Puritans to build Harvard in year 6, drove the Spanish crown to build a university in New Spain within one generation of conquering it, okay? Two branches of the same tree. I want you to understand who these people actually were, because the way they're usually described, backwards, violent, uneducated, in a way, that's true, but it also misrepresents what was happening. So the Scotch-Irish were not behind. They weren't inferior. They were carrying a pre-Roman Celtic culture that their ancestors had, preserved intact across millennia because the Romans never came to replace it. Okay, so the Lognainic, the Celtic honor price, this was the idea that every person had a face value that was how many cows were you worth. Social order ran through personal reputation and the willingness to defend it. And that system was still operating in Scotland and Ireland when they migrated over because nobody had ever done anything different. They had never come in with a legal system to replace it. None of that Romanness, that Roman culture, had been brought up to Scotland and Ireland when they came over to America. Okay? The cattle raiding culture, professional cattle thieves whose families basically ran stealing cattle as a business. It wasn't criminal, it was just normal. The warrior culture, the honor culture, where it was all about preserving your reputation. Okay, the pre-Roman uncolonized Celts were the same that entire time, and they were the same when they came over to America. Okay, so when the Scotch-Irish arrived in America, they didn't go to the north. They came in through Philadelphia and they moved south along the Appalachian backcountry, Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, Tennessee, Kentucky, and they settled where the land was cheap. The government was distant because no one was going to tell them what to do. Okay, that wasn't an accident. That was their cultural preference. Okay, the Celtic honor culture that their ancestors had carried for thousands of years was specifically organized around personal independence and deep suspicion of authority figures. Okay? They did not trust authority figures. That's just the way their Celtic culture worked. So written contracts, government officials, courts, tax collectors, they were tools of people who wanted to control you. Your family was real. The law was what powerful people used against you. Okay? And that really is still the culture down there. But that's the point of this lecture, is that culture still exists. Okay, so, and if you look at even like place names in the Appalachian backcountry where the Scotch-Irish migrated to, it tells you a lot about them. Bloody Rock, Cutthroat Gap, Gallows Branch, Killquick, Skull Camp Mountain. All of these are just in North Carolina. These aren't the place names of a people who are at peace with the world, at peace with authority. These are the place names of people for whom personal violence was a legitimate and socially approved response to conflict. Okay, exactly as it had been in these Celtic fringe regions of England, or of Britain, of Scotland and Ireland, and exactly how it had been before the Romans came to Celtic culture. Okay, so the uncolonized Celts founded their America in the south. The colonized Celts founded their version of America in the north. So by 1850, okay, coming up to the Civil War, 15 years after this, the United States had been a country for less than 80 years. Okay? Less than 80 years. We were a brand new baby country. The two groups had roughly the same amount of time on American soil. So the Puritan migration began in 1630. The Scotch-Irish migration was a little bit later, peaking in the 1720 to 1775, but roughly the same time period. Okay, so neither group had dramatically more time to develop. So the question we're going to ask is, what do the numbers show? So remember what we established at the very beginning. This is a natural experiment. The two groups are the cultural descendants of the same original Celtic population. Okay, the independent variable is whether or not their ancestors were colonized by Rome. Were they colonized or were they not? The dependent variables are the institutional outcomes that we can measure in American data. Okay, so independent variable, colonized by Rome, not colonized by Rome. Dependent variable, what happened because of that? And that's the research that we're going to do today, the stats that we're going to run. So let's look at literacy. So we have a census from 1850, and it's the first to record literacy data. In New England, the heart of Puritan settlement, the colonized, the most thoroughly Romanized people in this experiment, the white adult literacy rate was above 99%. Almost everybody was literate. In the deep south, the heart of the Scotch-Irish country, the uncolonized Celts, more than 1/5 of the white adults can't read. 1 in 5 white adults in the South were totally illiterate. Okay, less than 1 in 100 in New England. That's not a small difference. That's a huge gap. Okay, and it's between white people in the same country who have been on the same continent for about the same amount of time. Race can't explain it. Slavery is a partial explanation that we're going to look at later. But the point is that the literacy difference also existed in Britain before either group ever crossed the Atlantic, okay? And existed in those parts of Britain for the same reason it exists here. One group's ancestors received 15 centuries of Roman cultural transmission, okay, including the deep cultural conviction that literacy is a prerequisite for being a good citizen, and the other group's ancestors did not. That's why we see this difference in literacy. Of the 9 colleges founded in colonial America, only one was in the South, William and Mary College in Virginia, which was founded by not the Scotch Irish. It was founded by a group called the Anglican Elite, which were English, okay? So it wasn't, the one in the South wasn't even founded by the Scotch Irish. It was still founded by English people. So Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Brown, Dartmouth, Columbia, Penn, Rutgers, they were all north of that cultural divide, okay? They were the Yankees. You do not accidentally get 8 colleges in one region and 1 in another. You get that distribution when one regional culture carries an institutional inheritance that makes formal education of foundational value, and another regional culture carries an inheritance that treats formal education as submission to authority. That's what education is. It's just authority figures telling you what to do. That's the only reason why you would get educated. Okay. So what we're doing here informally is the chi-square test already without the mathematics. We're looking to see if there's associations between 2 variables. Do you see an association between literacy rates and each type of Celt? Do you see an association between the amount of educational institutions and the amount of and the type of Celt? It's very easy to see, even without doing the statistics in these cases, that there is an association between these 2 regions. Okay, here's another thing. In 1671, William Berkeley, who was the royal governor of Virginia, he was asked by the English crown to report on the state of education in Virginia. And here is his exact answer. I thank God that there are no free schools, nor printing for books and such, and I hope we shall not have these for 100 years, because learning has brought disobedience, heresy, and division, or sex, into the world. And printing has basically made it worse, and lies against the best government, okay? God keep us from both. God keep us from books and schools. This is the governor of Virginia in 1671 thanking God that there are no schools or books, and he hopes it stays that way for a century, because literacy creates disobedience. Compare that to Massachusetts in 1647, okay, 20 years earlier, already funding public schools required by law. You had a £5 fine for noncompliance. That's a lot of money back then, okay? So these are not just two random points, right, on a chart. They're 2 fundamentally different answers to the question of whether written knowledge, whether formal education are worth pursuing. One answer, literacy is essential. Schools must be built, schools must be funded, every child must be taught, and taught well. And that traces directly back through the Puritans, through the medieval Catholic Church, through Roman culture. Okay? And the other answer, literacy creates disobedience, thank God we don't have schools, traces directly back to the Celtic pre-Roman tradition where knowledge was oral, authority was personal, there were not institutions. All right, here's one more data point that's kind of random, but it's very interesting, okay? And you are going to calculate as a chi-square problem later on, so I'm just going to sort of introduce it so it can sit in your head and percolate. By 1860, the southern states owned 40% of all dairy cows in the United States. 40% of the cows. If regional culture had no effect on what farmers did with their cows, okay, if the null hypothesis of independence were true, okay, so the null hypothesis is there's no difference between the North and the South, they're the same. What percent of the nation's butter and cheese would the South have produced? They own 40% of the cows, they should be producing what percentage of the butter and cheese? 40%, right? That's what independence would predict, or independence meaning that the null hypothesis is true and the variables aren't related or whatever. And so what did the 1860 census actually record? The South produced only 20% of the nation's butter and 1% of its cheese. 1% of the cheese from 40% of the cows, okay? And historians note that German farmers who had settled in the same southern states, they were producing dairy products at dramatically higher rates than their Celtic neighbors. Same geography, same weather, same soil, same cows, but hugely different outputs, okay? And consider the Germans also came from regions of Europe that had been Romanized, okay? Maybe not quite as much as the English, but they had still been Romanized, and they brought with them this sort of systematic record-keeping productive habits that came with the Roman tradition. But the Celts down in the south, the uncolonized Celts, they descended from people who had let their cattle roam unfenced. They didn't feed them the same. They sort of let them grow wild instead of being well taken care of, because that's just the way the Celts did it. But the Romans were systematic. They were organized. They made sure the cows were producing at the maximum potential, okay? The Roman culture is very similar to Roman culture. Okay, this wasn't laziness by the Southern Celts. Okay, the Scotch Irish, those types of Celts, they would work hard. They fought hard. They hunted hard. They raided. They danced. They would do physical labor, but only certain kinds. They were averse to the kind of like patient, systematic, institutional activity. A regular milking schedule, careful aging of cheese, building of fences and barns. They didn't want to be fenced in. Attention to production records. Things that Roman institutional culture had trained into the descendants of the colonized Celts, over the centuries. So just another example of the difference between the two, and you can see the Roman influence in the north versus the south. And later on in this chapter, you are going to test whether that dairy output gap is statistically significant. You're going to put those numbers into a contingency table. You're going to calculate expected frequencies. You're going to run the formula, and you're going to determine whether the departure from independence is too large to just attribute to chance. So keep this picture in mind when we get there. 40% of the cows, 1% of the cheese, and the same cows in the hands of German farmers producing completely different results.